Welcome to today's session on planning and organizing your literature review. This is the first part of a two-part series on writing literature reviews. So this is an overview of today's session. First, we're going to consider literature reviews from a conceptual perspective. So why do we write literature reviews in the first place? And then we're going to consider how we make use of our sources in terms of engaging with those sources and organizing them, asking ourselves, what sort of questions can we ask when we are doing our reading? And importantly, how can we keep track of what we have read? And then we will conclude by considering how we might approach the organization of our literature reviews, specifically concentrating on pre-writing and pre-writing strategies that can help us structure our reviews. So my question to you, for you to reflect on and consider, is this notion of the academic conversation. How familiar are you with this concept? Is it something that you have heard reference to before? Is it something that you've encountered in your reading? And if it's unfamiliar to you, take a minute and think about what it possibly could mean. What might it mean, this academic conversation? So, in brief, the academic conversation is merely a way of conceptualizing how academics and scholars are discussing or engaging with any given topic. So regardless of one's discipline, when it comes to an area of, of research, an idea under investigation, different scholars and academics and researchers are going to have different perspectives on how we understand this topic. So we might ask ourselves, how are scholars engaging with a certain topic? Where is there agreement or disagreement? What is adding to our understanding? How is research currently moving knowledge forward? Often in very incremental steps, but how is knowledge developing around this topic? And then lastly, how might I join this conversation? So as academics, regardless of whether or not you're an undergraduate or graduate student, you have the ability to join this conversation. It might be through your interpretation, your analysis, or it might be that you are conducting some research that speaks to this topic. So what does this have to do with the literature review? Well, in some ways, the literature review can be conceptualized as that academic conversation made into a sustained piece of prose. And so as you are putting together your literature review, you want to be mindful of that conversation that is developing, and also ask yourself, hey, what are the questions that remain unanswered? Because in asking these sort of questions, we provide some space, or we create some space for our own ideas, our own research, or we could create space for someone else's research. So identifying the types of research questions that other scholars might pursue in service of trying to answer these questions. So that literature review really is about consolidating the conversation. So what is currently known or not known about a certain topic? You're providing that broad overview of what scholars have been discussing. And if you are creating a research project yourself and your literature review is part of the writing up of your research project, then the literature review is going to provide some context for your research project. And then secondly, when we're thinking about the literature review, it really is characterized by a synthesis of sources. So we're really striving to blend many different sources together in order to accurately present that emerging academic conversation, the dialogue that has emerged around a given topic. Now, when we're thinking about literature reviews, as much as we might wish it was a linear process where you just followed step A, step B, step 3, and so on, in reality, it is very much an interdependent process that is characterized by research, analysis, as well as writing. So our focus on writing will be in the next part of this two-part series. So depending where you are currently when you're watching this video, you might already have lots and lots of different sources that you have gathered, and that's fantastic. But the question emerges, well, what do I do with all of this research that I have sourced at this point? So we need to ask ourselves, how are we engaging with the sources and the research that we have discovered? And also, how are we going to keep track of this information? Because once you start to exceed 10 or so sources, it becomes increasingly complicated to ensure that we are keeping that information organized, especially if you need to go back and consider where multiple sources are agreeing around a certain topic. So we have a couple of different just logistical and practical concerns to work out as we prepare our literature reviews. So when it comes to engaging with sources, we want to be very mindful about asking lots of questions because as a reader, you are going to bring some new perspectives to your reading. And so you're going to try and reflect on, hey, what are the sort of questions might I ask so that I am engaging fully with the research that I have conducted and that I'm able to sort of show my readers that they can have confidence in me because I have engaged appropriately with the different sources that I've located. So take a moment, feel free to pause the video and reflect on the sort of questions you might ask of any given source. Now, I'd be very interested to hear the type of questions that you came up with. We're just going to look at a range of very generic but still targeted questions that are appropriate to most disciplines, or variations of these questions are appropriate to most disciplines. So we can always ask ourselves questions about purpose. So what problem has been identified by the author or the authors, and do they achieve their stated purpose? So if they were intending to investigate a certain topic or a certain problem, did they achieve that in conducting their research project, for instance? Then we might ask questions about value. So what knowledge will this idea or study contribute to the field? And is the research question worth investigating? And this might seem like a sort of strange question to ask, perhaps, but it really is about encouraging this deep reflection to see whether or not the research is sufficiently innovative, for instance, or if the question has been framed appropriately. So these are some questions that you can ask as you go through the reading. You might take a look at the sources that someone else has used on which to base it or justify their research, and really interrogate whether or not there's a sufficient range or quality of sources that the authors have used. And then you might ask questions about methodology. This is where you may or may not feel more comfort around asking these sort of questions, depending on your background. But certainly you want to spend some time considering how people have framed their investigation, and consider whether or not they have investigated in a way that you think is appropriate to the question. So you can ask yourself, who or what was studied, how was this rationalized, what tools or tests were used and why, what type of data was collected and why. So for instance, if there's a focus on quantitative information or data, but you think that the research question would have been better served with a mixed methods approach, where you'd be sourcing both quantitative and qualitative information, then that's something that you might want to surface in your critical review of this source or these sources. And then asking, was the method appropriate for answering the research question or exploring the topic? So again, don't discount the opinions or the analysis that you can bring to reviewing someone else's work, because no research study is ever perfect. Then we can ask ourselves questions about results and data. So were there any surprises? Are the results generalizable? Is there sufficient data? How is data presented? So if you are looking at a study and you are quite surprised because it's based on information from 5 participants, for instance, you might wonder, hey, does that generate enough information for us? And so you'd really want to consider how that has been justified by the authors. So what kind of measures were in place to ensure the validity of that data, for instance. And then lastly, getting into some of the discussion. How does the author or the authors interpret the data? What are the strengths or limitations of this interpretation? Does the author potentially use logical fallacies when interpreting results? So really just holding up sort of a magnifying glass, so to speak, to interrogating what people have shared in writing of the research. And then again, don't be afraid to bring in your own thoughts, your own analysis. So asking everything from, what were the strengths, weaknesses, or limitations of the study? How does the work relate to other relevant theories or ideas? And that question is starting to pull you into the realm of synthesis. So really considering how one study relates or one source relates to another source, or a theory, for instance. Next question, what assumptions do the authors make and are they justified? Is there any reason to suggest that the author is biased? Bias is certainly a possibility, so maybe looking at different affiliations. It's useful just to tease that out a little bit to make sure that there is nothing untoward about the research design based on someone's affiliations. What are the practical implications of the findings? Who funded the study? So this potentially relates to this notion of bias. So if you have a tobacco company funding a study, for instance, you might look at the methodology with a little bit more skepticism. So you always want to see if there are any special interest groups funding different investigations. From your perspective, what should be done moving forward? And lastly, if you were to meet the author or the authors at a conference, for instance, what would you like to ask them? Those kind of questions will reveal some of your engagement with the work. And I sort of alluded to this permission to critique a few moments ago, but I do want to really bring attention to this notion of giving yourself permission to critique, because perfect studies are rare if they exist at all. Certainly there are certain gold standards around research design, for instance, but in practical terms, often very, very difficult to design a study that's going to examine something in a very specific way, especially if you're working with humans or animals, just because there are certain ethical concerns, and any sort of investigation based on a human system will also be very difficult to sort of perfectly study. Because the reality is there are lots of constraints placed on researchers and academics. So there are concerns around money, around time, and as noted previously, around ethics. So keep in mind that yes, most of the stuff that you are reading will likely be of quite a good quality, especially if you're looking at reputable sources. But there are limits. There are concerns that should be acknowledged and are often acknowledged by authors in their conclusions. But if they haven't and you see something, then that's something that you can surface as a concern in your review. So when we're talking about biases, for instance, this is a very basic refresher. There might be some researcher biases, some participant biases, confirmation biases, measurement biases, and sampling biases. So the acronym WEIRD, for instance, refers to Western educated individual rich, democratic, and that simply speaks to how in a lot of the social sciences, if research is taking place on a university campus in a place like Canada, often you are drawing on a very, very narrow subsection of people, namely university students, and this can have implications for generalizing research findings to larger groups of people. So for more information on reading something like a journal article, I would encourage you to review the recording that is based on the May 17th presentation entitled How to Read a Journal Article. All right, so now we're going to shift focus a little bit. We're going to talk about how we might organize our sources. And I'd like you to take a moment and reflect on how you currently organize your research. So be honest. How do you currently organize your research? Are you simply printing everything out and making use of a lot of Post-its and piling papers all over the place? Do you use tables? Do you use folders on your computer? How are you keeping track of all of the sources that you are making use of for a literature review, for instance? All right, so I want to bring your attention to something that may be of value to you, especially if you're taking on a larger literature review than you might have written previously. So citation management software, sometimes also referred to as reference management software, are platforms that exist to help you organize information that you are gathering from online databases. So those journal articles, for instance. So some of the more popular ones include EndNote, Mendeley, and Zotero. I am not an expert on any of these topics, but if you want to learn more, there is a sure session on Zotero that is live on May 30th, and a recording will also be available. There are also existing LibGuides and older workshop recordings that are available on the University Library website. Now, other ways in which you might organize some sources may involve things like annotated bibliographies or matrices. And the benefits with these approaches is that you can really customize them so that they are specific to what you need and what you respond to when engaging with your research. So you basically keep track and organize and comment on sources. And I've bolded comment here because that's where the value really comes through, in that you can start to gather some of those initial thoughts that you've had and sort of formalize those comments so that you don't lose track of the ideas that you initially had when reading those texts. And just a reminder that good note keeping helps protect against accidental plagiarism. So making sure you know where information is coming from and that you're citing it appropriately will help to avoid any concerns with plagiarism simply because you will be attributing knowledge appropriately. Now, annotated bibliographies are common assignments in university, though you may or may not have prepared any of these yourself. And the premise is very simple. It's basically you take that citation information and you write a sort of critical summary. And the annotation itself is going to try and capture some of the emerging analysis, the emerging ideas that you have when reflecting on the content. And in many ways, the annotated bibliography is going to be a means of record keeping and memory keeping, because you're going to have a better sense when looking at those annotations, what you actually took away from that text. So you might ask yourself, what are the takeaways of the source? But then also start thinking about how one source may relate to the next. So we're going to quickly look at a sample annotation. The research context is based on this robotic animal, a gestocat, which has been developed to support individuals who have dementia. And so these robotic animals are increasingly used in nursing homes, for instance. So here we have a sample annotation published, or based rather, on reading the article Using a Robotic Cat in Dementia Care, a pilot study. So if we read through this annotation, what we see is information about the study itself, but then also our interpretation or our reflection on the significance or the value of this text. So let's read through together and keep an eye out for or note when that shift starts to happen, where it starts to move from that of a summary to that of a bit of reflection. So the text reads as follows. The authors studied the impact of a robotic cat, gestocat, on the mood and behavior of 4 persons living with dementia. The researchers used a mixed methods design that incorporated the Cohen-Mansfield Agitation Inventory and Quality of Life in Late-Stage Dementia Scale. Information gathered from these instruments was supplemented with interviews with professional caregivers and relatives. The gestocat intervention was shown to have some positive benefits, but the limitations of the small sample size mean that results must be cautiously interpreted. The authors acknowledge this weakness and likewise discuss how uncontrolled variables, such as extra attention given to participants, may have biased the results. Despite the project's limitations, the researchers conclude that the gestocat has merits as a therapeutic intervention and can be practically implemented due to its hygienic design and ease of use. Of concern is author affiliation with the company that produces gestocat, as one author appears in a promotional video for the product, speaking to possible conflicts of interest. However, for the purposes of my own research, this article reinforces that more frequent monitoring is needed to better assess the impact of interventions within this population group, given the often variable symptomology associated with dementia, which theoretically could be achieved through an AI-enhanced care bot. So again, take some time to reflect on what information is present and when that sort of shift occurs from more summary to more critical engagement or reflection. So how do you notice that shift, or what do you notice about that shift, and what value might it have for you as someone about to produce a literature review? All right, so here we have the same annotation, just broken down in terms of the content that is present. So we first have that project review and the methods, so a very, very simple summary essentially. And then we have some results and the interpretation, but then we have that emerging critique. So we're identifying this concern with author affiliation, and then concluding with some references to one's own research topic. So having an annotation like this is a good way for to keep our notes organized so that when it comes to putting the literature review together, we might look more at our annotations rather than having to go back to the text that we have already referenced or have already read. But certainly we could always go back to the original text if we wanted to pull in a little bit more detail. But in terms of thinking about how one source might relate to another source, these annotations will already start to help us conceptualize those relationships. So if you are interested in creating an annotated bibliography, these are some of the questions that you might ask. What did the authors do? How did they do it? What did they discover? How did they interpret results? What observations or criticisms do I have? And lastly, what have I learned about this topic? So those final two questions are really encouraging you to critically engage with the source in order to think about how you might incorporate reference to this source into your literature review. Ultimately, for an annotated bibliography or annotations to have any value to your own process, they need to be meaningful for you. So you might consider how a source will feature in your literature review, and whether or not this is information that you'd incorporate in the annotation. But it can also help you reflect on the sources that might end up being highlighted. So there might be more attention given to them in the literature review based on your engagement with the source in question. Now, I will recognize that putting together an annotated bibliography is time consuming at the beginning because you are taking time to go through and sort of summarize these texts that you've read. But it can be a situation where it saves you time later on because you've already done a lot of this work at the start. So it is something to consider if you're not familiar with putting together an annotated bibliography. It might be something that you will incorporate or consider incorporating the next time that you write a literature review, because it can be a very effective way to just keep track of your reading in a way where you're not going to be overwhelmed with notes, because the intent is really just to have one healthy paragraph per source. All right, so when I talk about writing, I often have folks reflect on their preferences when it comes to engaging with text. So here we have two sample pieces of writing that relate to the same topic. My question to you is, which one of these do you prefer and why? Now, there's no right or wrong answer. It really is about assessing your preference, because the more awareness you have of the type of writing that you gravitate toward, then you can take that knowledge and start to implement it into your own text and your own writing. But let's take a moment. Let's look at these two samples and take a moment to think, hey, which one do I gravitate toward? Do I like sample one or sample two more? So sample one reads as follows. Baptiste reviewed 85 instances of elderly women who experienced hip fractures following falls. He determined that in the majority of cases, these falls were preventable. Beyond the physiological impacts of these falls, the cost associated with such injuries was significant. Adams also studied instances of elderly women experiencing hip fractures in her study. According to her research, most of these falls were preventable. Meanwhile, in 2018, Statistics Canada released a report on the costs associated with bone fractures in elderly populations, which often result in expensive hospitalizations. These injuries are often caused by falls and are largely preventable. Sample 2. Bone fractures in elderly populations are commonly associated with falls, the majority of which are preventable. Moreover, these injuries are frequently responsible for costly hospital stays. All right, so which do you prefer and why? Take a moment to reflect on that before we look at these pieces of text in a bit more detail. All right, so in this comparison, we're really starting to think about this notion of synthesis. both of these samples have a degree of synthesis. In that first sample, we are drawing together similar sources. So we have the Baptiste source, we have the Adams source, and we have the Statistics Canada source. And they all sort of group around this shared topic of um, bone fractures in elderly populations. And so we see some relationships emerging. However, the second sample is also emphasizing this notion of a relationship, but it is knitting the studies much more closely together. And so often when we have text that is more intentionally synthesized, more closely synthesized, this can enhance readability simply because we aren't reading the same information over and over and over again. Instead, what we are doing is foregrounding the common information and then identifying this sort of shared quality through our citations. So rather than having as much detail from all the individual studies, we're focusing on what's common and how can we identify that this information is shared by two or more sources. We can do that through our use of citations. So it might be that you like sample 1 because there's a lot more detail, or you like sample 2 because it's a lot more readable, or it may be that you're looking for something a little bit in the middle, where there's going to be more tightly communicated commonalities with a little more detail. But the purpose of thinking about synthesis in this way is that one of the most common pitfalls when it comes to writing literature reviews is a tendency among writers to just have one study after another. So study 1, study 2, study 3. And the issue with this is that it doesn't really add any value for our readers, because they're really looking for us to put the work in as part of our writing so that we are demonstrating awareness of relationships and narrative so that so that the readers don't have to do as much work trying to figure out the information that's most relevant for them in order to understand your main argument or the justification for your research project. All right, so let's talk about synthesis a little bit. Now, here we have a sort of random assortment of little icons, little images. And I would encourage you to pause the video for a moment and go through and group these different images together. How would you start to organize these different images? So take a moment, pause the video, and start grouping to see how you might organize these images. All right, so how was that? How many options did you come up with? I'll share some of my my means of organizing. So I first thought, well, the easiest thing might be to distinguish between animals and food. I saw some overlap because of that image of the cat in front of a plate of food. And then the treasure chest, no obvious connection. So I just left it out when organizing that information. Then I thought, okay, well, maybe I could be a bit more nuanced. So I'm going to distinguish between black and white animals, cats, and food. Again, some overlap, and once again, that treasure chest gets left out in the cold. Next, I consider, well, maybe I'm going to group it around sleep and food. And this will result in both the treasure chest and one of the cats being left out. So the purpose of that activity might seem a little bit silly or simple, but it is to remind ourselves that this is sort of an activity that we are actually quite familiar with. It's something that we are often introduced to in early childhood. So it's something that we're often doing without necessarily being aware of it. But when it comes to putting a literature review together, it really is about trying to find those patterns, albeit in a more abstract and text-based way. So when we're thinking about synthesis, the first step is really part of our research where we are finding sources that appropriately cluster around the topic or idea that we are investigating. So we are spending lots of time pulling papers, but at the same time, we are also rejecting a lot of sources because it might be that the title initially seems related to what we are focusing on, but as we read the abstract or the introduction, we discover actually this is irrelevant. So synthesis starts from that basis of selection when we are doing our research, because we are both selecting and rejecting. And so once we have our related sources, then we want to start teasing out those relationships. And so one of the best ways that we can really start to clearly distinguish how different sources relate to each other is through use of something that's known as a synthesis matrix template. And what this is doing is it is trying to, or it enables us rather, to get more of a bird's eye view so that we're not focused so much on single studies, but instead we're looking at commonalities and relationships. The benefit with a matrix template like this is that it's very flexible, and you can make it as personalized and as detailed as you want. So here we have an example of a matrix that has been populated with a number of different studies clustering around this topic: what interventions reduce the likelihood of bone fractures among elderly populations. So we have our citation information, our source information, but then we have some columns that are helping to make the study information more relevant to our literature review. So we're considering the different research foci, the methodology, and then how we are identifying strengths or limitations of those different studies. And so once we have that matrix populated, then we can start identifying where there is more overlap. So it might be that multiple sources are really interested in the role of exercise in reducing the likelihood of bone fractures, or it might be that we are really interested in the impact of, or the information gleaned from longitudinal studies, and we see multiple longitudinal studies, and there are some strengths and limitations associated with that sort of research design. So we'll start to see different patterns emerge, and then that gives us the ability to really concentrate on how we can cluster very similar studies together. So it really is just about comparing studies more readily, sort of at a glance, if you will. Now, once you start seeing a lot of these commonalities starting to emerge, this might help you to distinguish among different themes or sub-themes that you might develop and explore as part of writing your literature review. So here, if you're familiar with a mind map, here is a very generic breakdown of what a literature review might look like on a mind map. So we have an introduction, the different themes, some sub-themes, and even some sub-themes that will emerge. And so we can start populating a mind map with information that is more related to the topic that we are exploring. So in this instance, for example, The main themes might be bone density, interventions, costs, and demographic shifts. And within some of those themes, we have some sub-themes and then some sub-sub-themes. But as we start to reflect on how we've organized this information, we might determine, this might be ineffective or might not accurately capture what I want to surface in my literature review. And it's not about discarding any of these themes or sub-themes or sub-sub-themes. It might be about reorganizing them. And what's really fantastic at this stage is that it becomes much more elastic. It's much easier to make large structural changes at this point before you have written a lot of text. So you might reorganize the information in the following way: fewer main themes, but perhaps more developed sub-themes and sub-sub-themes. So moving information around demographic shifts and costs into an introduction, for instance, as a natural way in for your reader. So when it comes to this mind mapping stage, again, it's all about flexibility, really trying to think about how different themes and sub-themes best relate to each other before committing to an outline and a lot of writing. But once you do have that information in your mind map, then it can become much easier to start conceptualizing how this might look in a linear format. So starting to think about that possible outline that could emerge. And this is where you would start to go back to that research matrix and start populating your outline using those related studies, so you know how you're going to surface those commonalities or those relationships when exploring different themes or sub-themes or sub-sub-themes. So again, a way to, the mind mapping provides that opportunity to sort of really play around with the ideas, whereas the outline is a way to start envisioning how things are going to present themselves in order as you write your literature review. Now, rather than using a word table for your matrix, you might decide to use an Excel template instead. Here I've identified two potentially useful sources for you, so I would definitely encourage you to go and review those resources. So we have Dr. Elaine Gregerson's article, How I Use Excel to Manage My Literature Review. And then we have Dr. Raul Vega's conceptual synthesis Excel dump technique. And on his website, he actually has a template that you can download if you would like to use his approach to for tracking, organizing, and critiquing literature. Now, why all this emphasis on synthesis and blending sources? Simply for readers, it's going to reflect your deep engagement with the research that you have conducted. It will demonstrate that you have that knowledge, and so it's going to convey a certain degree of confidence to your readers that you have that sort of guiding hand in managing or shaping the conversation. So it's going to create a favorable impression. It's going to also provide a little bit of insight into the behind the scenes work that was done. And in that you've already done the more difficult work in identifying how different sources relate to each other. But also it is often just a style of writing that is more appealing, and it will reflect potentially your style of writing and create text that is just more enjoyable to work through. And that's often what we're striving for as writers. We want to make sure that people who are reading our text find it easy to follow, so that they are really focused on the contents and the idea of your text and not getting distracted by how that information has been put together. Now, when it comes to ordering information, figuring out how those themes, subthemes, and sub-subthemes relate, unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that. It's very dependent on both the context, but also your interpretation of how these different ideas relate to each other. There's no one way to do it. So it is a matter of embracing some of that uncertainty and ambiguity and participating in what's often quite an imaginative process. So you want to consider, who is my reader and what information do they need when, in order to help you organize that information. So take some time, play with outlines, consider whether or not some sections need to move around. Remember that often that first draft is really just going to be a first draft. Most texts require multiple revisions. You also don't need a perfect outline before you start writing. And I'd also encourage you to seek out feedback, especially after you have worked through that first draft, so that you can gain a reader's perspective to get a sense of whether or not there is a sense of logic and coherence in terms of how the information has been organized. Now, as a final tip, just a reminder that systems only work if you stick with them. So pick ones that realistically are going to be meaningful for you and that you're going to be able to stick with. But you can also make adjustments as necessary to suit your needs. And also remember that you can make use of strategies in complementary ways. So you might make use of a citation manager as well as a matrix, for instance, in order to keep your information organized and memorable for you. So the second part of our series will focus more specifically on the different organizational structures of literature reviews, and then some key writing techniques to help make the text that you produce very engaging and readable for your audience. All right, so if you do have questions, obviously you can't surface them in a video recording, but you can send me an email. You can contact me directly, Jill, Jill, dot McMillan, McMillan, at USask.ca. So if you have questions, do feel free to reach out. All right, take care and happy writing.